Ladies and gentlemen, this Red Gaming Tech.com video, we're going to be giving you a list of the best graphics cards for the money. It is July 2013. As normal, every 1 to 2 months, depending on the movement in the GPU industry, I'll release a new video just to give you guys a brief overview of what's hot and what to avoid in the graphics card marketplace. Now, I will be giving these prices in US dollars as well as Great British pounds. Secondly, I would like to point out that this list is assuming you have no bias for either AMD or NVIDIA. Now, with that said, let's jump right in. First card I'd like to recommend on the cheaper end of things would be the Radeon HD 7750. This comes in either 1 or 2 GB variants. Now, for the most part, you're probably better off with the 1 GB, although I suppose if you can get the 2 GB not too expensive, then you might want to plump for the extra little bit of money. This will cost you about $95. Or if you're paying in pounds, you're going to be looking at about 72 to 75 pounds, depending on the make and model exactly that you're going for. If you can plonk down a little bit more money, this is a case where saving up just a little bit does really help you. You can actually get the Radeon HD 7790, so once again we're sticking with AMD in this particular case. There are a couple of versions of this, 1 GB or 2 GB. The cheaper end card, the 1 gig, you're looking at about 115 US dollars or about £100. If you're going to go with something a little bit meatier, in other words 2 GB models, you're going to be looking at about £130 or about 150 US dollars. With that sucker, you're looking at about 896 shader units, 56 texture units, core clock of 1000, and memory clock of 1500. It does require one 6-pin connector, and you're looking at a 500-watt power supply. This is completely contrary to the previous card that I mentioned, which does not require an auxiliary power connector. So anyway, moving up the ladder a little bit. If, however, you're looking to spend a little bit more cash, you're looking at about $165 or about £140, then things get a little bit more spicy. For a start, NVIDIA come into the picture, unlike the lower end cards. So this gives us either the GTX 650 Ti Boost, that's a 2 GB model, or another 2 GB model would be the Radeon HD 7850. It's really unknown which one's the better one. I personally would recommend doing some Googling on various comparison reviews and seeing which game you play and see which one does better in those particular games. Honestly, there's not that much in it, however. Personally, however, I would recommend to not go with either of these two cards. Instead, I would recommend opting for the GTX 660. I'll repeat that one more time. The GTX 662 GB. That is a lot more power for the money. You're looking at about 200 US dollars, maybe a little bit cheaper, or about 150 Great British pounds. So it's not really that much of a difference in terms of pricing. However, you do get a lot more oomph for your money. You'll actually be looking at a 450 minimum power supply and one 6-pin PCIe connector to provide power. Other than that, however, you're looking at 980 MHz core clock, 1502 MHz GDDR5 memory. You've got a lot more memory bandwidth as well, 144 GB per second, 80 text units, and 960 shaders. So it's definitely worth the extra if you can splurge out. Once, however, you're hitting around the $240 to $250 mark, things get a lot more compact really quickly. The GTX 760, which is a new version of Kepler, has been released, and this requires a 500-watt power supply. It requires 2 6-pin connectors, and you're looking at 96 texture units, 32 ROPs, 980 MHz, though it does go all the way up to 1033 MHz turbo, although once again a lot of this does depend upon, of course, the model. And finally, you're looking at 1152 shader units. Now, the cost of this card, of course, depends on make and model, but you're looking at about 250 to 260 US dollars, or if you're paying in Great British Pounds, you're looking at about 236 Great British Pounds. It's a pretty damn good card. In case you're wondering in terms of how well it performs, it's going to outperform most cards of the previous generation. It's it's actually below the GTX 670 in most benchmarks, but it's a little bit cheaper as well. In my personal opinion, I think the sweet spot in this is actually still the GTX 670. It does perform slightly worse than the 770, but it's not that much slower. Now, you're going to be looking at about 350 US dollars. Once again, this does depend on the make and model. You can certainly get them to about 330, but the better cards are going to be a little bit more expensive, but you can by all means plump for one that's about 330 US dollars. If you're looking at Great British Pounds, then depending on, once again, make and model, you're looking at about 270. In my personal opinion, this is a really good card for the money, and I would actually think twice before going to the GTX 770, especially if you're on a fairly tight budget and you're building a new rig. On the other hand, of course, the GTX 770 does overclock pretty damn well, and so it is a good card, but it will be a lot more cash for maybe about 10% extra performance, depending obviously once again on the game and the resolution you are playing. I would once again highly encourage you to do some Googling on this. Speaking of the GTX 770, one can be yours for about 330 Great British Pounds. If you're looking in dollars, on the other hand, you're looking at about 420. So obviously it's quite a discrepancy. It's about $70 more expensive, depending once again on the make and model that you're going for. This is a pretty damn fast card in my personal opinion, and will definitely be enough, just like even the GTX 760 or even the GTX 670 will be enough to run most games at 1080p at max settings, depending on levels of anti-aliasing and anisotropic filtering, of course. In regards, however, to the GTX 770, you're looking at 1536 shader units, 128 texture units, 32 ROPs, 1046 MHz core clock, that's without boost, 1752 MHz GDDR5 memory, and of course memory bandwidth is about 224 gigabytes per second. As for memory capacity, you're looking at between 2 and 4 gigabytes. Most people would be fine, especially if you're only running a single monitor, especially at 1080p at 2 gigabytes for now. The minimum power connectors for this, by the way, is one 6-pin and one 8-pin. For most graphics cards, they do come with a 6 to 8-pin converter, and I do say most because by all means that is not set in stone, so you might want to do some Googling if you say settle on one particular brand and say, you know what, does this actually come with the connector? If your power supply is a little bit old, it is a 600 watt required for this. Of course, just as a little bit of a point out, all the core clocks and memory clocks are based, it highly depends on which version you go with. Obviously certain manufacturers set theirs a little bit differently. Once again, there's about a 10% performance difference depending on obviously the game and so on between the GTX 670 and the 770. Moving on to the higher range market, and for about 540 to 530 Great British Pounds, or if you are paying in US dollars, you're going to be looking at about 650 to 660 US dollars. You can get the GTX 780. This is a single card solution, of course. You're looking at, once again, a 600 watt minimum power supply, one 6-pin and one 8-pin PCIe, so that's pretty much exactly the same as the GTX 770. You are looking at a decent performance increase, however, you're looking at 2,304 shader units, 192 texture units, 48 ROPs, and a core clock of 863 MHz or 1502 MHz for GDDR5. and that is with a bus bandwidth, of 384 bits and about 288 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth. Once again, this also comes with 3 gigs of RAM. I'd also like to point out, once again, the core clock, the boost clocks, and the memory clocks and so on will differ depending on make and branding of your card, and obviously you will be looking at a decent performance increase. The difference is about 10 to 15%, once again heavily depending on the game, how much memory it requires, the resolution you are playing, and a lot more besides. Of course, once again, just to illustrate, if your CPU is not up to the challenge, you will need a very beastly CPU on these type of cards to be able to feed the data into them as well, just to let you guys know. Now, you've got a little bit of a decision to make if you have even more cash burning a hole in your pocket. You can either go for the GTX Titan or you can go for the GTX 690. Now, both cards do cost about the same. However, it's worth noting that the Titan is actually slightly slower than the GTX 690. So why on earth would you want to go with the Titan? Well, as it turns out, it's actually a single card solution. So it actually requires slightly less power. And because it's a single card solution, in games that don't really do too well with SLI, it can perform slightly better. Now, opinions really differ between the Radeon HT 79 and 90 and the GTX 690, but most people, from what I've been reading, do prefer the GTX 690 because they say that it's slightly better in terms of driver and so on. Personally, I would say the Titan is probably the better card for most people because of scaling with games. Once again, this is a case where I'd highly recommend you do some reading. It's not like either card is going to be a bad solution. Anyway, just as of course, your CPU will need to be pretty damn good for this card, of course, either card for that matter. And once again, in case you're wondering about Titans and GTX 670s and also, no, I'm sorry, GTX 690s and so on, obviously high resolution displays are typically what you need for these suckers. So anyway, I think that just about covers the list for July. Hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I've tried to do it a little bit differently, so throw in a bit of extra advice. If you guys do not like that format and prefer the older format, you could by all means either leave me a message on Facebook, that would be facebook.com/redgamingtech, or alternatively, good sir or good lady, you are more than welcome to leave a message directly on YouTube. I typically do not respond to comments simply because, well, there are so many of them and there are a couple of us working on the channel and so forth. So if you do want to message directly on YouTube, you can do so. Or you can, once again, go to facebook.com/redgamingtech. You're much more likely to get a snappy response from that. Just to also point out, you'd also need to address that specifically to me. That would be either Paul or Crimson Rain. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I will see you soon. Take care and bye for now.